Well, thanks for coming along to I think it's a couple of months since we had our last webinar. It's been a little while. Obviously, a lot's gone on since then, and in some respects, the world's changed with a new government and a whole set of different assumptions and things to think about. So today, Dan and I will be taking you through a lot of what's happened. I'll start off by looking at the King's speech last week. We sent a briefing note out about that, but then just a general post-election review, reviewing what was in the manifestos, or particularly the Labour manifesto, obviously, and what that might mean for funding in local government, and then looking ahead a little bit to the future fiscal event, which we think is going to be probably in October, or certainly sometime in the autumn. And I think there's going to be a big bombshell announcement next week telling us just how bad things are in the public sector. Then Dan's got an update on the state of local government finance, looking at the latest data that he's got from the financial accounts work that he's doing. So some really interesting insights there. Just to let you know, we are recording the webinar, and I'll have a recording of it available on the website. I say tomorrow. If I can get them quickly, I'll do it today, but it's more likely to be tomorrow. I'll put the slides on almost straight away after we finish today. Usual format for today's session. First hour, Dan and I doing the presentations, and then 11 to 11:30 questions and answers and discussion. I think what Dan refers to as the after party, but we'll do our best to keep it light and interesting. So my session to start off with, and the agenda for that, starting off just quickly looking at the ministers that have been appointed within the newly named MHCLG. Then we'll look at the King's speech, what's in there and how that affects local government funding. Then the manifesto, so looking back a little bit at some of the work we did during the election campaign itself at the manifesto and what Labour has proposed and how that might affect local government. And then, as I said, looking a bit further ahead, looking at the fiscal commitments that effectively this government's signed up to, the latest public finances data, and then any intelligence we can pick up or we picked up about the timing of the budget in October, and then the spending review as well around that. So the ministerial lineup, and as we know, the departmental name change, Back to the Future, Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, where we were probably about 4 years ago, was it, I think? So at least it's a name that we are familiar with and can get our heads around. So these are the ministers: Secretary of State Angela Rayner, and also Deputy Prime Minister. So obviously that, again, as I guess it was under John Prescott back in the Labour years of the past Labour government, Deputy Prime Minister is also our Secretary of State for our services. I've also put there where the MPs are from, the ministers are from. So Ashton underline Angela Rayner, Jim McMahon, a fellow Greater Manchester MP, he's Minister of State, and I guess he'll be the one who will be dealing with most of our local government finance stuff. But Stuart maybe will tell us different about how this is how it would work within the department. Then we've got a couple of MPs, Minister of State Matthew Pennycook, who is also a London MP, Rushanara Ali, another London MP as well, and then Alex Norris MP, who's East Midlands, Nottingham North and Kimberley. So it's an interesting split there, 2 Greater Manchester, 2 London and 1 from the East Midlands. Not that it necessarily means anything, but it does at least tell you where they may be coming from in terms of how they will see the world of local government funding. So the King's speech, as I said in the briefing note last week, what's most important from a King's speech is not necessarily just the legislative programme for the coming year. What can be more important is kind of the wider narrative. That tells us a bit more about what the government thinks is important, what its priorities are, but also just to be aware that most of the stuff that a government will do will be outside that programme and what goes through Parliament. But looking at what was in that King's speech is interesting enough. So clearly we know that a key priority for the government is around house building and infrastructure investment, and there's a major piece of legislation planned around planning reform. and as well as some comments about investing in the planning process. That planning and infrastructure bill, that's going to be a huge part of what the government does in Parliament over the next year, trying to free up the system for planning and building and getting more built. And behind that, the idea is that as more gets built, that brings on economic development and economic growth, and that gives them the space to spend on public services. Then this idea that they've made quite a lot about leveraging private investment by using public investment. Clearly, very constrained public resources, and Rachel Reeves continuing with the previous fiscal rules, which doesn't distinguish between borrowing for a revenue purpose and borrowing for an investment purpose. So trying to use public investment to get in as much private investment as possible. The government believes that for every £1 of public investment, it can attract £3 of private investment. So using what the public sector does have to get even more back from the private sector. And that's this National Wealth Fund bill. And alongside that, some changes to the international, the investment banking, with 2 investment banks that are publicly controlled within the public sector, and bringing those 2 banks together. Then bringing some services under central government control and influence. I guess you would call it nationalisation, but it feels a little bit, it doesn't quite feel quite such, kind of a 1947 sort of nationalisation. It feels a bit softer than that. The contracts for railways will be brought back in-house when they come up for renewal in the future, rather than any kind of great confiscation. Great British Energy is more of a partnership really between the public sector and the private sector, again, rather than a takeover of anything that any private sector organisations are currently delivering. And then I think with some public sector delivery of energy as well. So it's a little bit, I wouldn't quite call it, because so far as to call it nationalisation, it's really more applying more central government control and influence. Then there's this requirement for the OBR to provide its opinion for every fiscal statement, the Budget Responsibility Bill. The initial draft of the King's Speech briefing note said that it was to guard against the mistakes made by the Liz Truss administration. You can't really say that in that kind of impartial briefing notes. That's been withdrawn, but we all know why that's been brought in. Every future fiscal statement will have to have a statement accompanying it from the OBR. Then there's a whole range of changes in employment rights, moving towards a genuine living wage, the Employment Rights Bill. That could cause quite a bit of controversy as that goes through, but that's obviously a key thing that the government wants to deliver. And then probably the thing that's got the most direct importance for the local government as a sector is devolution. They clearly want devolution to play a really important role in what they want to deliver over the next 4 or 5 years. They're going to widen and deepen devolution in England through the English Devolution Bill, and give mayors a lot more powers, wider powers, particularly around housing, strategic planning, skills, transport, infrastructure, buses. So really the things that can deliver economic growth. I guess some mayors are probably a little disappointed. They would have preferred more around the public service reform kind of space, but what the government wants mayors to really do is around economic growth. So what are the implications for local government funding? In some respects, a limited impact. The budget and the spending review in the autumn or later on next year will have much more impact when the Chancellor makes those big fiscal choices about how much funding, how much taxation, how much spending goes on within the public sector, and how much of that goes to local government. That's going to be the really big announcement. But there are some things that will have a big enough impact. I think some of the reforms around pay will increase social care worker pay rates and conditions. This new deal for social care workers, plus some potential change in working practices, particularly things like pay for travel time for home care workers and that kind of thing. And a wider point to make here is about public sector pay and who funds it. You'll have seen the pay review bodies have recommended a 5.5% increase in pay for teachers. That's more than was budgeted for, and there's going to be a big discussion about who pays for that, and that the same applies to things that will come through in local government as well. Social care workers being one of them, but other parts of the sector as well. Some small-scale additional funding announcements. These weren't really in the King's Speech itself. They were in the manifesto, but Labour was proposing 20 million to fund 300 new planning officers. To be honest, that looks like a real drop in the ocean. There were some big changes to planning processes that were proposed, and clearly a much greater priority for service outcomes within planning, within local government. The briefing note around the King's Speech talked about them needing to be more funding to close what it called a funding gap. The service currently costs just shy of 800 million, and the government's saying there's a 262 million shortfall in that. So a 20 million injection of funding is not really going to make any difference at all to that. It's worth noting as well that planning was the fastest growing major local government service in 24-25 in the budget, albeit from a lower cash base than some of the other services like children's or adult services. It was growing by 22%. The planned growth in 24-25 was 22%. So clearly there's going to be a lot of pressure to spend more and do more in planning within local authorities. And then there's this growing layer of local government around mayors and combined authorities. And I think over the medium term, that's going to raise some really important questions that will affect what's the rest of local government. Will it attract funding that would otherwise go to other local authority tiers? Will this new tier overshadow existing authorities? And should the mayoral combined authorities be included in the existing funding regime or have a separate regime outside it? I don't really know the answers to any of those questions. I don't think anybody does, but clearly mayors and combined authorities are the part of the local government world that this government really wants to grow and to give a lot more responsibility to. So that part of it is going to make a big difference, and it will inevitably impact on our own funding as we currently get it. Then looking ahead, or looking back at the Labour manifesto, and the things that I think are important within that we'll have a quick look at. First of them, multi-year settlements. It was something that every party actually wanted to do as part of within their manifesto. If you're being cynical, you'd say, well, they would do because it was free, didn't require any money to give you a multi-year settlement. But actually, I think they're more difficult to deliver than would initially appear to be the case. So Labour wants to give councils multi-year funding settlements and to end wasteful competitive bidding. I think we can all sign up to that and support that. And to have greater flexibility with integrated settlements, again, for mayoral combined authorities, where they can show good public money management. So what we're looking at here really is longer term settlements, 3 or 4 years, I'd imagine. But I can't really see them being able to give us meaningful multi-year settlements until after the major spending review. Now that spending review could come in, they may do one relatively quickly this autumn. I think what's more likely is a 1-year spending review this autumn and then a multi-year spending review sometime next year, kind of July 2025. So that means that even if they do give us multi-year settlements, they're only really going to start from 2026-27 onwards. So that leaves us with a 1-year rollover settlement still being the most likely option for 2025-26, although we could be proved wrong if they do manage to move a bit more quickly on the spending review this autumn. And the same goes for introducing funding reforms. Again, I think this is more difficult. The only point really that this can be done is if it coincides with the start of a longer term settlement. So again, 2026-27 seems like the point at which any funding reforms would need to be made. And I think it raises the question as well about whether or to what extent this government would want to do funding reforms, and the extent to which they would want to use the political capital that they've got on making funding distribution changes, and whether there are other things that are more important for this government. And then Labour talks about abolishing business rates. If that is the case, and we'll talk about it more in a second, that means a baseline reset and more uncertainty. And again, that's only really the kind of thing that can be done as part of at the beginning of a multi-year settlement, unless they're happy to have a lot of upheaval during the period of a multi-year settlement, which kind of undermines the whole point. And then Labour's talking about providing capacity and support to councils and to overhaul the local audit system, something Dan will talk about or refer to in his presentation later. So council tax Band D, future council tax levels not even mentioned in the election manifesto. Labour have not repeated the commitment to freeze Band D, which was made after the 2023 local elections, and instead have said that they would have to be realistic about it. Our view is still that the thresholds won't change from their current level, 1.99 core increase, 2% precept, social care precept. DCN have asked for a £10 threshold for shire districts. Few shire districts are now benefiting from the £5 threshold. I'm not quite sure what sort of success that would have, but there's a similar argument for fire authorities who until this year had a £5 threshold as well, at least for some fire authorities, and that would actually help most fire authorities. That would make a big difference to most fire authorities. The other parties proposed increasing the second home premium. It will already be 100% from April the 1st, 2025. Possibly that's something that this government might want to think about, pushing it up to 2, 3, or even 500%, which is what would be available in Wales. But that won't raise huge amounts. It's the big tax base increase, Band D increases that will make a big difference to revenues. The bigger question really during the election campaign was about council tax revaluation. There have been lots of stories about Labour wanting to revalue council tax and add more bands. You may call that a mansion tax. Of course, revaluation would redistribute the burden of council tax across the country. It was pretty comprehensively ruled out by Rachel Reeves. She said in an interview with the FT, "It doesn't really matter whether I think it's sensible or not. That's revaluation. Is that where I'm going to put my political energy? No." So fairly comprehensive view there that that revaluation won't take place, and I think I can see why they wouldn't want to do that, because it's an enormous amount of upheaval, lots of losers who will complain, and it's a very difficult thing to do. Jonathan Ashworth at the start of the campaign talked about we're not doing council tax banding or council tax rebanding. So as I say, I think revaluation is very tricky. There are ways of doing it without moving too much money around. There's a good report from the Centre for Cities that talks about that, but I really can't see them going much down that road. The graphic on the right is from the Telegraph, Daily Telegraph, who obviously wanted to raise the spectre of revaluation. From my point of view, I'm really not quite sure that's something they want to do. There is this thing about adding new bands, say splitting Band H and giving bands within that much bigger weightings. That would generate additional gains, but they'd be quite localized, I think, to London and the southeast, and then that would require quite a lot of equalisation to redistribute that income across England. So lots of difficulties with that, and I think some would point out that actually the comments made by Rachel Reeves and Jonathan Ashworth effectively rule out any type of changes to the bandings. It's not just about revaluation, but actually splitting those bands. The question for council tax more generally is whether Rachel Reeves thinks that she needs to generate more income from council tax, and that actually, although they made some promises during the election campaign, that actually they just need more money from it, and that's one source they can go for. So I don't think we can conclude that there'll be no changes beyond what we already have for council tax. Abolishing business rates is a curious one, I think, from Labour. They talked in the manifesto about replacing business rates with a tax that will raise the same revenue but in a fairer way, and levelling the playing field between the high street and online giants. I think what's more likely is reform rather than wholesale replacement. A full replacement would be something very, very different, and I think would take a while to develop, and possibly isn't even is a second Parliament kind of objective if that's what they were going to do. Retention could continue with the reformed business rates, but it would require a baseline reset, which of course we're expecting anyway. I mean, some of the reforms might be things like changes in the valuation basis to put a greater weighting on online warehousing valuations rather than on-street high street valuations, that kind of thing. But that's the kind of thing that you might do as part of the planned revaluation in 2026, and that would really be consistent with how the system currently works. We could expect that some kind of business rate retention might continue even with a heavily reformed business rate. So housing, this target to build 1.5 million houses, as we said, it's a major objective for this government. It wants to support councils and housing associations to build their own capacity and make a greater contribution to affordable housing supply. So there could now be more opportunity for local authorities to build their own housing and to help with their own homelessness and housing problems, which is something I know a lot of councils want to do. So I think we can expect there to be more financial incentives to build houses. Currently, we only have New Homes Bonus, and to my mind, it seems unlikely that this will be discontinued in 2025-26, and until they have something to put in its place. It would be odd to say we want to incentivise house building and then to remove the only financial incentive that the government has in place to encourage councils to do that. So possibly some greater incentive to build, maybe something around revaluation, maybe something around equalisation or something like that. But of course, councils already retain all the growth in their own tax base anyway. And then pressure on local authorities to speed up their planning processes. Of course, after councils have spent years taking savings from this service, so future budget pressures for local authorities as the government puts pressure on you to spend more money on your planning services. Social care, we've kind of covered this already as part of the King's Speech stuff. Of course, Labour's already committed to the NHS workforce plan, of which more later. Very expensive investment if that's what they're going to go through with. Social care charging reforms, I'll pick up on the next slide. And then this idea about the National Care Service focusing not on national standards and delivering care consistency. So I think it's about those national standards rather than about taking social care off local government and delivering it through a kind of a similar NHS type regime. But these are all commitments that will require substantial expenditure. There'll need to be more funding made available, both for social care as well as for the NHS more broadly. Our view is that social care will need to have more funding, and that our default assumption is £500 million additional funding for social care every year, in addition to the current baseline. But even that, I think, is on the low side. So let's see what comes out in the budget later this year. Social care charging reforms, interesting to see CCN, County Councils Network's report that came out, I think it was on Monday or maybe on Friday, about the charging reforms. What CCN are saying is that they are still supportive of the reforms, which are meant to come in October 2025, but they're just saying that they're so expensive, they're not a priority for councils at the moment. And even if they were to come in with funding in 2025, it's too quick, it's too soon, nobody's prepared for it. So I think, notwithstanding what CCN have said, in my view has been that the funding that you've got for social care that has come from the charging reforms, that's in your baseline now, you're not going to lose that. But if this government wants to do charging reforms, it'll have to find more money to do that, and that'll be very expensive. Will they want to do that? I'm not sure they will. When you look at the numbers, it's effectively a transfer of resources to in quotes, more affluent households in London and the wider southeast. Is that really how this government's going to want to use, £3 or £4 billion a year? I'm not sure it is really. So I think that's one for the back burner. Various small announcements that came through in the manifesto. We mentioned the ones that probably affect you directly, apart from potholes. A massive £65 million to deal with potholes, something else that all the parties can agree on. Police and fire services, some promises to build up police numbers, no specific numbers, but they talked about, £400 million recycled from elsewhere within the police budget. So that's not even new money. So let's see how that works. Fire and rescue services, no specific mention of any additional commitments or funding for fire within any of the party manifesto. So let's see what comes out of the budget. Other issues, two I'll pick out here. I think the homelessness one, this is clearly becoming a huge problem. Some of the pressure on homelessness, as you well know, is enormous. And a 17-18% increase in budget for housing in 2024-25. Possibly some of the government's work on renters reform, renters' rights, etc., will help to ameliorate the problems around homelessness. And then this UK Shared Prosperity Fund, talking about how that will be reallocated within England as well as the whole United Kingdom. This point about devolution and about local authorities, as we currently are, and combined authorities, a growing sector and a growing tier within our sector, I should say. A major focus for Labour government. You see that picture on the right as well. I don't recall a group of local authority leaders gathering outside the door of Number 10, just after an election. They're clearly an important part of what this government wants to do, about devolving economic powers rather than public service reforms. Really, it very much is about economic growth, about local transport, infrastructure, housing, planning, and skills. A big announcement yesterday in Barnsley about skills and employment support. Talking about giving integrated settlements to these MCAs, building on the model that's already being developed in Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. So that really is something that I think where a lot of energy will go in terms of developing how local governments are funded within England. So it's a big deal, I think, and one to really pay a lot of attention to. Just thinking quickly about the finance settlement, as I mentioned, I think a rollover settlement with few changes from the 24-25 settlement, which is kind of the line we've been following for quite a while now. No funding reforms in 25-26, no fair funding review, no baseline reset. So that kind of, well, obviously not finally confirmed, but it's extremely unlikely. And our modelling already reflects that position. The one thing I would mention, though, is that our modelling reflects the most recent plans for funding reforms in 2026-27 that were effectively in place from the previous government. So I may come back and think about what that might look like in 2026-27, but we'll think about that over the next few weeks. I think New Homes Bonus now looks more likely to survive. As I mentioned, this government surely can't abolish NHB without a suitable alternative. Council tax thresholds, will they remain the same? I think so, but I think there is going to be more pressure on Rachel Reeves to find ways of generating additional funding. Cash flat or better for SFA and other grants within core spending power. So our key assumption at the moment is cash flat for those grants within CSP. I wonder whether that could be slightly better. Let's see, sort of 1%, maybe even 2% increase in those grants possibly. And then I think more funding for social care to pay for the pay increases and other pressures. I said 500 million, but it could be something more than that. Just very briefly, just to say, I've updated the MTFP model, and that's now on the website. Only some minor amendments, nothing major in there, but just some housekeeping changes. Then finally, before I hand over to Dan, just a quick look at some of the fiscal policy stuff. So the Labour's manifesto indicated a 1.2% real terms growth in public spending. But as you can see from the chart on the right from the IFS, when you take into account all the growth in other priority or protected services, that does not leave very much for non-protected services like local government. The implication from the IFS's numbers is that there'll need to be a 1.6% real terms cut in funding for unprotected services. So that's effectively a cash flat settlement for everybody else. But for local government, that depends on some other factors. Will they take into account council tax so that you can get, say, a cash flat overall settlement, but with cash terms cuts in grants and an increase, and offset that by an increase in council tax? That's kind of what happened during the period of austerity. I don't think it'll happen this time round, but clearly that's something we need to watch out for. Additional funding for social care, I think so. I think that's effectively now a protected service. And then other decisions on tax and spend could be that Rachel Reeves wants to generate more tax revenues to spend on public services, but that won't be easy for her to do. One thing that's worth pointing out is about NHS funding and pressures, and just the sheer size of the increase in NHS spending that has effectively been committed to by this government. The workforce plan would imply a 3.6% annual real terms growth rate for the NHS. And you can see there on the right hand side in that chart from the Nuffield Trust just how much additional money would need to be found for the NHS over and above what's currently in the plans for public spending. It's a very, very considerable increase in funding that would need to be found for the NHS. Wes Streeting said he wants to resist just this begging bowl culture of just putting more and more money into the NHS, but given the scale of the problems he's got to handle, I think he's going to need more funding, and that has to come from a very limited purse. Last couple of slides. Fiscal choices for Labour, they really are not easy. As the FT said, the public finances remain in a parlous state. So public borrowing is already higher than it was expected to be in the spring budget, 3.2 billion higher. Labour promised not to increase the rates of income tax, corporation tax, or VAT. There are other options, but these are unlikely to generate significant sums. So in the short term, Rachel Reeves is faced with some difficult trade-offs. I think it's likely to be a combination of some tax rises and some spending restraint, and then delaying a full spending review to 2025. But she is kind of expecting a miracle to occur in some respects by relying on economic growth to get the government out of this the hole that they're in. Not going to be easy. There's a Treasury audit of the public finances that comes out. I think it's next week now. So we should get kind of the full horror of what the government wants to present to us about the problems that are lurking within the public finances, followed, I think, by a budget in the autumn. That now looks likely after the party conferences, so sometime in October. And let's see how much of a spending review we get. My guess is just a 1 year one with a full multi-year spending review sometime in 2025. I've kind of run out of time to take you through this. It was an interesting piece of work about, fairly academic really, but interesting, about whether this government's fiscal inheritance is worse than the Conservatives government's fiscal inheritance in 2010. The short answer is that they were both very difficult, but this government's got much less room for manoeuvre in terms of what it can take out of public services. They're already much vastly cut back from what they were in 2010. But it's worth reading that article. It's quite interesting. And then finally, just to remind you, we have our annual conference on the 12th of September. As I say here, it's our first in-person event since the pandemic. So as many, if you can come along, that'd be great. Lovely to see you. We've got some great speakers, good opportunities for networking, and a smashing venue. So if you want to come, still places available. I think we're about 2/3 sold out now. So if you want to come, book a place, and we'd like to see you there. Okay, Dan, over to you. Oh, you on mute, Dan?
Right, I'm muted myself. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I'm going to take you through the latest accounts analysis, and I suppose in so doing, try and get to a look at the state of local government financial resilience at the moment, something that I'm sure the new government will be grappling with, as well as all of yourselves. If we move on the slide, Adrian. So we'll look at the accounts and audit backlog, but then delve into the balance sheet and have a look at the state of things like usable revenue reserves, dedicated schools, grants, deficits, and then a whole load around capital, need to borrow, internal borrowing, whether there's a massive debt burden in local authorities, and the impacts of the interest rate rises over the last couple of years, and the impact on financial resilience. If we move on one first, we'll look at the accounts and audit backlog. So this data is true as of last Friday. I think it's still true, unless any of you are going to tell me that you've released accounts in the last 24 hours, because I had a quick look yesterday. 2/3 of English authorities have now published their accounts. Now, this is way ahead of the same point last year, but still 1/3 of authorities haven't published, and so there's still an accounts backlog. We're near the size of the audit backlog, but a backlog nonetheless. I'd expect in July, quite a few of the delay notices say that end of July is a date, so I expect we'll be close to 3/4 in the next couple of weeks. I'm expecting a few sets of accounts to be published over the next couple of weeks. You can see there the accounts backlog is really catching up in upper tier, but much less so in districts. And when we look at audit delay notices, we can see more districts that have resourcing issues. And I think as well, auditors have tended to leave the districts slightly behind the upper tier authorities. You can see more action, audit action happening at upper tier than you can in districts. We move on Adrian, please. So if we, these stats look at whether the accounts backlog is has been impacted by the audit backlog. So, and it clearly has. So if you've had your 22-23 audits signed off, you've got an opinion, you're much more likely to have been able to publish your 23-24 accounts. So you can see there that all but 4 upper tier authorities that got final status in their 22-23 are published for 23-24, and far fewer, although still quite a sizable chunk, have published despite not having the brought forward figures agreed by their auditors. And they're unlikely to have that now, aren't they? Because by the end of September, we're not going to see much by way of audit completions over the next couple of months because the auditors are at the NHS. So quite a few, I think, have reluctantly published accounts because they don't feel they're 22-23, and so in some, quite a few instances actually, 21-22 and earlier accounts still remaining unsigned. You see that districts are slightly further behind, but again, if you've had your 22-23 accounts signed off, you're more likely to have been able to publish than if you've not. So if we move on, another one, this is some work we did a month ago to all the delay notices that were there at the time. If you're unable to publish, you should publish a delay notice. And those that gave a reason, the majority of those reasons were previous year audit backlog. So unwilling, unable to publish accounts because last year's audit hasn't yet been finalised. A sizable number still quoting valuation issues, which kind of is part of the backlog, isn't it? Valuations around PPE, valuations around pensions, get the auditors quite excited, make them less likely to be able to sign off your accounts. So again, you could probably add those into the audit backlog as the reason for not publishing. And as I said a little earlier, quite a few more districts with just resourcing difficulties in the team that have meant that they haven't been able to get the accounts over the line. And I think that's something we're seeing increasingly in districts. I think there are a lot more people leaving the profession that are entering it. So I think there's a slight crisis in terms of resources, and some authorities are really feeling that. So if we move on and we look at the audit. So let me explain these two graphs. The graph on the left there, just a bar chart, the number of opinions that have been issued, colour-coded blue and red for 21-22 and 22-23 since September 22, which is when all of the 21-22 opinions should have been issued. Nothing was issued prior to that. And you can see last year a really slow uptake of audit opinions all the way through the year, but in the second half of that graph you can see a lot more activity. So 23-24 opinions are way ahead of what they were at the same point last year. That's shown in the graph on the right. 97 opinions were issued by June for 23-24, whereas at the same time last year only 61. Bear in mind that's 97 out of 315 authorities, so it's still a whopping backlog. But you can see there's a lot more activity back to the left graph than on the right hand side of that left graph. A lot more 23-24 accounts out, and quite a bit of catch up on 22-23. But if you look over the year in terms of those 2 years, 230 audits, opinions were released against 315 authorities. So there's still a slightly increasing backlog. But I suspect you can see a lot more activity, the auditors, and hope come September when they return from the NHS, one would hope that will ramp up again. If we move on one, Adrian, please. So in conclusions, if we're asking, does the accounts audit backlog easing? Well, partially, much more the accounts backlog, and that's due to the focus and hard work of finance teams, particularly upper tier, getting the accounts over the line. But still big signs that previous year audit delays are impacting on publishing accounts going forward. And then, of course, you have the backstop data and all of that that got kicked into touch by the election. Adrian quoted earlier a little bit about what the new government might do on that. And I know SIP for LASAC have come out and said they're going to try their hardest to address this. But I'm not sure aware of anything particularly concrete at the moment. So it's catching up, but it's still got a long way to go. If we move on to what the accounts are saying. We'll start with usable revenue reserves. There's a lot of fuss made by the previous government about reserves going up and up and up, but in the last 2 years, they've gone down, and they've gone down at a rate that is quicker than any of the rates of increase that preceded it. And they've gone down to such an extent that if it was to continue, local government generally in aggregate would be in a lot of bother. And if when we look in a minute at some of the extremes, there are already, I suggest, a number of authorities that are really, really struggling. So if we move on one, Adrian, you can see here, this is money terms here. And it's interesting, as more and more accounts come in, the usable reserves drop further. So there's a little bit of a link. If you've published your accounts later, then the probability is that your reserves will have fallen down more than if you'd published them earlier. Now, that's a pretty general rule, and there'll be lots of exceptions there. But as we've been monitoring this over time, the reduction has got bigger. So at the moment, we're looking at 5% cash reduction in reserves. That's 7% in upper tier, and actually districts are still seeing reserves go up in aggregate, although there's a big, somewhere are going up by a lot. Still quite a lot of districts with reserves start to fall. If we move on one, that's in money. This one was in money terms, but in actual fact, a proper real terms proxy is a proportion of core spending power. Core spending power went up by 10% for upper tier in 23-24. Pressures have gone up. Inflation was in double figures in that year as well. So when you look at it in terms of core spending power, reserves actually fell by 14% across the board, and district reserves haven't in real terms really gone up. They've probably stayed about the same, but for upper tier they've come down, and particularly outer London Mets and unitaries, they've come down significantly at rates that are not sustainable. If we move on one, Adrian, we'll look a little bit individual. So looking at the districts there, the top graph shows usable revenue reserves as a percentage of core spending power. When I say usable revenue reserves, I mean general fund usable revenue reserves, general fund balance, and general fund earmark reserves as a percentage of core spending power. And you can see here that there's a massive disparity between the level of reserves, and there are only 17 districts out of 100 that have now published that have reserves that are less than a year's worth of expenditure, a year's worth of core spending power. But if you look at the change from last year, which is the bottom graph, see it's roughly 50-50. There are reserves dropping at a number of authorities, yet they're increasing at more, and the increases tend to be slightly bigger than the drops. So if we move on to upper tier, this is much more interesting and much more worrying, I guess, because when you look at their reserves as a percentage of core spending power, there are a quarter of the upper tier authorities that now have less than 3 months core spending power held in reserve. And if you think about some of the shocks to the system in the last few years, COVID, the invasion of Ukraine and all of the economic conditions and turmoil, the cost of living, that doesn't feel like it's a sizable level of reserves to be holding for a quarter of the authorities. And actually, the majority of authorities, 78 out of 111, have less than half a year. So that, to me, I think the new government, and as well as yourselves, upper tier have got an issue there, and that plays into the funding. If we move on, we look at the change as a percentage of core spending power. You can see there, with only a very small number of exceptions, 9 out of 10 authorities have seen fairly sizable reductions in reserves in the last year. I look at those two anomalies there, two unitaries in yellow. The one on the right, I'm not convinced that's a real increase in reserves, but more likely a bit of a problem with collection fund treatment of Section 31 grants, because I can see that authority had 80 million sat in its collection fund adjustment account last year. So I'm not entirely, and that's swam through into reserves this year. I'm not entirely sure that that's a real increase in reserves, but rather a reduction in just an accounting technical adjustment. So that brought it into reserves lastly. And the one sort of a third across the massive drop is a unitary authority that had put a load of money in its reserves with the intention of paying the government back for its share of a crossing of the Mersey, and has just paid that back. So again, not really, it's probably a planned use of the usable reserve that it set aside. So not as drastic as it might look, but something that was planned. So if we move on one, so that's a really drastic reduction in reserves, and reserves as a whole have come down significantly in cash, and in real terms, effectively, they've come down significantly. And 9 out of 10 upper tier authorities have seen falls in reserves, most for a second year. So I think the continuing reductions in usable revenue reserves simply isn't sustainable, and is creating a sort of significant concern in terms of financial resilience of the sector, and particularly for some of those authorities on the left of those diagrams I've just shown you. If we move on one, we'll move into dedicated schools grants, I think. So on the 8th of June last month, the top of the BBC website was that there was £1 billion shortfall in special educational needs. That's to do with another demand-led area and insufficient funding. But we think the BBC is a bit wrong, because about to show that we think the shortfall is much closer to 2 billion, probably higher than 2 billion. If we move on one, I'll tell you what I mean. So these are dedicated schools grants deficits. It's cash that's out of the door, spent on special educational needs, but for which there is a statutory override which allows us to hide the deficit away in an unusable reserve, but won't allow us to hide it away forever. In fact, in 2 years' time, it comes back, and all things being equal, will mix with usable revenue reserves. And some huge deficits, and contrary to what people might have thought, those deficits are accelerating. But the government has come up with a safety valve agreement whereby it agrees with an authority. The authority will make a load of difficult decisions to address their deficit. And it's fair to say for some authorities, and I've spoken to a couple of authorities who say they've got safety valve and it's not having the effect that the government would want. But in aggregate, those deficits now are they're not going up any further. They're kind of treading water, and one would hope they might start reducing sometimes in the future. The problem is for the 38 authorities, some of which it's working for, not all. There are 150 authorities, and 3/4 of these have a deficit. So the safety valve arrangements aren't even available to the majority of authorities. And you can see if you've not got a safety valve arrangement, the red line, your deficits are going up and up and up almost uncontrollably. And if we move on one slide, this is the dedicated school grants deficits, the proportional core spending part of the top slide. And you can see there 3/4 have a pretty big deficit, and the bottom slide shows the change of deficit in 1 year. So you can start to see, for instance, I live in the area, it's the first green blip that goes upwards. The county with the biggest deficit before, but it's actually reduced this year. It's still got a whopping great deficit, but it has a safety valve arrangement. So it's sort of working to an extent, still got a long way to go, but you can see the majority of dedicated school grants deficits are increasing. And what you're actually starting to see is some of those quarter at the right-hand side of the top graph there are starting to see increases in the deficit position. So they're moving from surplus towards deficit. So something's got to happen here, hasn't it? I don't think this can be left alone, or if left alone, it will simply get bigger and bigger, such as the demand, the demand-led nature of that particular service area. If we move on, I think we move on to, and as a whole, you can see there the dedicated schools grants now over 10% of the value of usable revenue reserves, and if that's allowed to keep going on and on, usable reserves coming down, deficits going up, eventually it might catch up with reserves, and that would be catastrophic. In fact, there are 2 authorities already this year that have dedicated schools grants deficits larger than their level of usable revenue reserves. So if they can't get these under control when it comes back in 2 years, they would have negative reserves. Not good, and lots are tending towards that as well. So we move on now. I think we move into capital. Saying the public might be forgiven, I think there's a big debt crisis. The Public Accounts Committee said there's a debt mountain at UK accounts that's reached staggering levels. And so let's have a look at 23-24, and let's try not to be as narrowly focused as Oflog is, as misleading as Oflog is in this area, and look at things in a bit more detail. So if we move on one, so let's first look at the capital financing requirement. In actual fact, this is in absolute terms. So if you compare it to spending power, it's actually come down. There's a lot happening in London, lots of London authorities doing lots of building, regeneration, housing, etc. So capital finance requirements are going up there, but everywhere else that might be inching up a little bit, but generally not very much. So there isn't lots of debt being piled on, with the exception of those few London authorities. But if we move on one, if we look at it as core spending power, that's the top graphs there. Left is upper tier, right is districts. You can see CFR as a proportion of cost spending power. You see big disparities between left and right. You've got Warrington on the right of upper tier, you've got Spelthall on the right of districts. Not surprising that both of those authorities have big commercial property portfolios. But on the left, you see the change in cost spending power, and you could, change in CFR as a proportion of cost spending power. And you see at the majority of authorities, it's coming down significantly. That big blue line is Merton, that paid it sold a commercial commercial investment and has paid down its debt. That's why it's gone down by so much. But generally they're coming down. There's a few districts going up. They also appear to be in Lancashire. There's a lot of capital going on in Lancashire, but they're all from a point of having quite low CFR. So generally debt is not going up. But if we move on one slide, the composition of that debt as to whether it's internal or external borrowing is really interesting. And you won't get this from Oflog, because just don't look at it, because they don't really understand, I don't think. But this to me is the worry around capital. Look at Outer London and Unitaries particularly. They are reducing the level of internal borrowing, which means they're increasing external borrowing, which effectively saying they can't sustain their internal borrowing position, have to go. They're not necessarily doing a lot more capital. They're just existing debt is moving from internal to external because their resources are dwindling. They might have huge dedicated schools grants deficits. Their reserves are coming down. There simply isn't the cash that there was, and they're having to externalise borrowing, and they're externalising at a bigger rate. And if we move on one level, we should be able to, and again, sorry, Adrian, I think all it does is put, you can see that Outer London and Unitary, where internal borrowing is reducing, the interest payable is going up significantly. That's because they're taking on new borrowing at much higher rates, at 5% rather than the 1% a couple of years ago. So that's a big issue there. They're not borrowing anymore in totality. It's just the nature of that borrowing is being externalised a lot more, and they are losing out, and that will have an impact upon their revenue health. And it's no coincidence, actually, that Unitaries and Outer Londons are really suffering as much as anybody else in terms of reserves drop. So it's a double whammy. If we move on, another one. So this now looks, this again taken from your accounts, it's your interest payable and interest receivable, which is your financing notes for CIES. You can see there that interest payable has gone up by quite a bit, but not as much as cost spending power, except with London and Unitaries, where they're borrowing more externally, of their borrowing requirement. But look at interest receivable; it's gone through the roof. So, you might think that interest rates going up is bad for local government, and for those that have to borrow externally, it is. But for the majority of authorities, they're really they've still got like healthy cash balances, put those on the money market, and they're making significant amounts of interest receivable. So I don't buy into the view that the interest rates has necessarily been bad for all authorities. It's actually been good for some. And if we move on, we've got some pretty graphs. So what you see there is net interest. So this is interest receivable less interest payable for all authorities. And you can see there on the left, those are the ones paying lots of interest. Those on the right, they're actually receiving more interest than they're paying on their debt. And the two graphs below show the change in that. So you can see the vast majority of authorities are doing well in terms of they're getting much more interest in, and they're not paying necessarily as much interest out. So rates have done well, but you can see some exceptions there in both districts and upper tier, and you can see a number of authorities, particularly out of London and Unitaries. I've looked at those particularly, and they are authorities that have got dwindling reserves. They might have a DSG deficit that's getting worse, and they're not necessarily borrowing more, but they're being forced into externalising their existing borrowing. So they can no longer sustain their internal borrowing position, in which they're paying nothing for the borrowing, they're just using their own resources, and they're going out having to pay 5%. So for me, this is the big capital risk problem. It's not so much extra capital expenditure that is adding to the CFR, it's existing CFRs and the sustainability of internal borrowing. And if we move on, I think this is my last slide. So is there a really debt crisis in local government? Well, I'm not sure there is across the board, but there are some authorities that, because of depleting resources, aren't able to sustain their internal borrowing position, and it is becoming a bit of a crisis for those. And have high interest rates impacted financial resilience? Yes, they have, but in a lot of cases, they have done positively. Altogether, I'd say capital is really complex. Debt as a proportion of core spending power is actually coming down, but the composition of debt is more worrying because of other parts of the balance sheet. And that's why we'd always say not to trust in Oflog and their dodgy data, but rather get a much better view of the whole balance sheet from your accounts and how the various moving parts interact with one another. And that, I think, is it, Adrian. I might have another slide, but it's probably just one that says, thank you for listening. No, it's the annual conference.
That's it. I thought I'd finish off with that slide just to remind you, if you want to come along. That's brilliant, Dan. Spot on time as well. Blimey, it's a complex picture, but the reserves thing is, and the DSG, it's a huge worry, isn't it? And one thing I thought we might have talked about, but in the end we didn't have time, was about the RA stuff and about the increases in budgets in 2024-25. It doesn't look like that's going to slow down any time. I mean, the increase in budget is slightly lower in 24-25 than 23-24, but looking at your figures, Dan, that's not going to get any better, any easier, is it? No,
and I think it feels to me like there are a number of authorities, particularly those at the left-hand, the upper tier authorities, and a handful of districts as well on the left-hand side that have already very low level of reserves and still seeing a depletion rate. It almost feels like that something external has to intervene. I've said before, the previous government was able to blame individual issues at Birmingham, at Croydon, and Slough. What we're seeing now is a whole group of authorities that I think are managed quite well, but because of a funding system that's been so locked, find themselves on the wrong end of that funding system and are really, really struggling. That feels like it's a structural problem to a degree, and one that this government has got to be aware of. I put in the chat earlier on about the impact of council tax. The number of our members we speak to that are either stranded on Band D or have got always had high rates of council tax support and very low growth, and find themselves in a system that's 2/3 council tax now, simply unable to raise the sort of revenues that those with much higher tax-based growth and much wealthier tax bases can. So I'll be interested to see if the government introduces any form of resources equalisation. And it's not definite, but you can start to see signs in resilience that the authorities that have done really badly from the freezing of the formulae are now starting to look really shaky in terms of resilience. There's always exceptions to that rule, but I can start to see that Met authorities, for instance, are not looking ever so well when compared with years ago, and they've done the worst collectively out of the funding formulae freezing over the last few years. They tend to have low tax bases and have a much bigger reliance on government grants.
Yeah, it's a lot of sort of tensions just built up in the system. Actually, I should have said thanks to everyone who's just come along and needs to go after an hour. Thanks for coming on and listening to us. But otherwise, the floor's open. If you've got any questions or comments you want to make, just either put them in the chat or just raise your hand or just start speaking. Any of those things is fine. We've not spoken together as a group for quite a while, so any thoughts you've got about how things are going or what any of that information or data looks like to you, just feel free to come forward and mention it. Tony, hi there, Tony. Hi.
Hello, hi.
Good to see you.
I got here early, and you too. Thank you both very much. Glad to have got here rather earlier than I expected to see the sort of variegated news. I suppose the mentioning of off log begs this question, because the new government, like the previous one, in a sense, needs to have access to the kind of analysis we have just seen in order to come to a balanced judgment about which councils definitely need short-term help, which ones can just be left alone. But then there's a sort of systemic issue, which is that the slow development of problems to do with the DSG, which is the ultimate example of a crisis hiding in plain sight, as our American colleagues would call it. Yeah. But there's a not dissimilar one with some authorities with housing, I think. Not big. I don't really know much about housing, but so in a sense, the question that faces the new government, it seems to me, is but without the need to do things that always deny the recreation of anything that looked like the Audit Commission, is what that they will now need to do, other than hire you, to get a grip on where they probably do need to help individual councils, where they need to help like the Mets as a whole, as you say, are particularly badly treated over time because of the low tax base. And frankly, for the new ministers, with due respect, understanding what they've inherited must be very, very difficult. Yeah. I mean, because what this system now is a system inherited from the past, which has been frozen, tweaked, changed a bit here, changed a bit there, to the point which I, for one, certainly can no longer understand. Yeah. So my rambling question is, do you have any advice to the government, apart from hiring you, as to what they might do to know which authorities to help rationally, in which order, and to identify what measures they should take?
Yeah, I think it is about that understanding, Tony, at the heart of it, isn't it? Because the previous government, I think, was irresponsible with exceptional financial support, in as much as they just let the authorities that are least capable of taking on new debt do exactly that, almost like a Wonga-day payday loan at increased rates, to kind of kick the can down the road. So they had an injection of cash because they've got capitalisation directions that allowed it, but with very little view as to how they'd ever pay that back. So Oflog just feels like it's picked sort of 2 or 3 obvious indicators, and it's not. It's far more complex than that. So those measures won't work for it and won't work for the government. And it is about getting a more complete understanding of the balance sheet. I think some of the things some of those structural problems can be sorted out. The council tax ones, for instance, maybe with a bit of resource equalisation. But then there are a number of authorities, I suggest through little fault of their own, have found themselves in a poor position. And the government really needs to understand how all the moving parts interact with one another in order to have got us to where we are now, and therefore try to repair that. My fear is that just coming out with initiatives based upon a lack of understanding will help the wrong authorities or not help as many of the authorities that need helping. I don't know what anyone else thinks on that.
Yeah, I wonder as well, is that this regime that we had under the last government, it always felt like they had the opinion that the people who were coming forward for help, it was their fault.
Yeah.
They'd either run themselves badly or they'd made poor decisions or whatever it might be. It didn't feel like, oh yeah, we understand that you're in trouble financial trouble because there are things that beyond your control or you've really struggled with and we can help you. Like you say, Dan, just offering them the opportunity to borrow the way out of it is not a long-term solution. And I think the problem for local government is that the problems are coming from lots of different places, like the pressure on children's and the growth in children's costs is huge in some places. I mean, just looking at the growth, places like Bradford and Barnsley, for instance, two places where the growth has been huge this year in the budget in children's, massive increases. It's like you were saying, Tony, in homelessness and housing. Then there's the DSG problem. Then there's the things about misallocation of resources because there's been no change in the funding regime. There are lots of things there that they need to be aware that there are people will be coming to them with problems because there are lots of different sources for those problems.
I'll just do one light thought. I mean, there's sort of what my economist colleagues, I'm not an economist, but I work with several, would call a moral hazard issue here, which is there are very good reasons for intervening, as with the DSG, to help authorities that through no fault of their own have got into financial difficulties. But the more you intervene to help them, the more the others will think, well, why did we behave like that? Or why did we try and get some extra cash? And, that going along that very awkward path of finding out which authorities help because they're in genuine need through no fault of their own, and aggravating all the others that have carefully managed their resources and are not in that situation. That can only be done by really, this is why I'm not suggesting, though I am actually, the recreation of the Audit Commission, but some sort of neutral and independent way of making a judgment, it seems to me, is absolutely essential. And poor old Oflog, I do think its officers tried hard, were never allowed to do that. They ended up effectively doing something else. Anyway, enough from me.
Yeah, I suppose, Tony, as well, when you think about the last couple of years of this last government, I suspect a lot of the civil servants thought, well, local government's complaining, but look at their reserves, they're going up. They're saying they're in trouble, but at the same time, they're stashing away money. But they were looking at old data from the RO forms that's often wrong, and included lots of other things that Dan's adjusted for. And the real story was actually reserves were falling for the last 2 years.
But so I said I wouldn't say anymore. One final thought there, I really will shut up. But I mean, it seems to me that at a cursory, unresearched glance over the last few years, local government in England is far more willing to run down or to start to spend down reserves if it is more confident of its financial position looking forward. So whatever we think about the former government, Michael Gove, who was a powerful minister, got the 3 best settlements for local government since 2010. And surprise, surprise, when these settlements turned out to be above inflation for many authorities, councils then felt more confident to use their reserves. Once you get into a position as after 2010, when in most years council thought next year was always going to be worse than this year, surprise, surprise, they build up reserves. So there's a sort of further sort of portal of sort of not quite a logical, non-illogical portal here, which is that if you give councils certainty, multi-year settlements, no real terms cut, they probably would gradually run down reserves a bit where they can afford to, because they'd be more confident. But everybody on the call knows more about this than I do, because they're actually running budgets.
And I think back to when I was 151. It is, even when Greg Clark became Secretary of State, I think it's he who introduced the 4-year settlement, and it was a pretty grim settlement, but it was 4 years. And I think even in grim times, knowing what's ahead over the next 3 years is infinitely better than the Michael Gove years, which, although there were much, much better settlements, no one was able to sort of in advance say, well, we know in 2 years' time we can add this and add this. So I think a big, massive step would be a 4-year settlement. And then after that, perhaps more money as well. Because it's the not knowing that's as hard as the finally knowing that it's not too good or it is better. I think I saw a hand up there, sorry. Came up. We've got a hand up. Stuart Hogan.
Stuart, hi there, Stuart.
Hello, everyone. I missed the start of today's session through a Teams catastrophe, but I just wanted to pick up Dan's point. I agree, Adrian, that the scenario that you painted about the upcoming settlement being a 1-year spending review, a 1-year settlement, a longer consideration of the options for reform for the remainder of this parliament. I agree that's the most likely outcome, but I did just want to, almost for devil's advocate, want to paint an alternative which picks up on some of the themes that we've touched on already, and that is that got a new set of ministers coming in with no experience of being a minister, no experience of working across departments, and a very, very complicated and difficult set of issues to pick up, and all the challenges that have been laid out. So right now they're considering their options for the settlement for the coming year, and also the options for reform. And there's just a possibility that they think all of the noise that they've made about stability, forward planning, certainty, all of that suggests, why don't we do a multi-year settlement for this year and take longer to do the reform process? So don't try to fit it in over the coming year, but take longer, maybe even concluding towards the end of the parliament for implementation in a second term of government, which would of course open up lots of options that are closed off at the moment. For example, does anyone still believe business rates retention is a good idea? That's not something you can change in 1 year, but it is something you could work to change over the parliament.
Yeah.
Now, to do a multi-year settlement, you would need to have some reassurance about forward financial totals, and that might even stretch very unusually beyond the term of the spending review. It seems likely government will do a 1-year spending review because there are too many difficult issues to try and resolve in the time that's available. For example, the defence review is cited as 1 year, so the timing for a 1 year then a multi-year review would work quite well for that. So you would need special permission to do that. You would also have a significant political problem, which is lots of authorities would figure they would win from reform, so they see it being postponed again. So you would need to try and introduce more money into the baseline, and you would also need to try and have the way you distribute that money is more acceptable to those who perceive that they would win from reform. So it's not without obstacles, and I think the course that Adrian was charting out, which is the one we've been talking about for some months now, really since the last settlement, is the more likely. But I just thought it was worth putting on the table. There is another way forward if you choose to take it. It's not the best, but it might be the best being the enemy of the good. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Stuart. It's kind of, I know what you mean, that they have made quite a lot of noise about the multi-year settlements, the integrated settlements for combined authorities, and they didn't mention fairness or redistribution at all in their manifesto, did they? Nothing in the King's speech, nothing. It doesn't feel like that's where they've been putting their efforts or their thoughts.
Yes.
Yeah. But I know what you mean. I think I guess the issue would be whether, like you said, they would need a bit more money to do that, wouldn't they? They couldn't say, okay, it's cash flat plus council tax on top of that, and off you go.
Yes.
That seems a bit.
Yes.
That really would be that would be a tough sell, I think, wouldn't it?
Neither course is easy, but the point about sell, I think, is important. Rachel Reeves has been very clear that she's very focused on political capital. Where are your priorities? What are you going to spend time doing? And I think there is when they see the numbers, the winners and the losers, and also the Tony mentioned earlier the tweaks and twists of the current system. Well, if you look at winners and losers through any process of reform, it's not just your share of the cake in the future that matters, it's your starting point that matters. And authorities now have pretty random starting points arising from a whole series of short-term tactical adjustments made over a number of years, and of course external factors like accumulated business rates. So the approach on winners and losers for any package of reform is very complicated, very varied, and I think very challenging. So the temptation to take longer over this, and also to wait for this promised bonus of economic growth in the future, funding higher levels of public expenditure, is quite tempting, really. So I think that's why we've heard nothing about this at the moment. We've heard quite a lot about devolution, which is really a development of the current position, with two added extras. First of all, a strong focus on economic growth, and second of all, a general tilting of the table towards local authority interests. But it is fundamentally a development of the current position. We've seen that because it's an easier position to reach. We've heard, as you say, Adrian, we've heard nothing about fundamental reform, about allocation of resources. All of those things are more complicated, more difficult.
Yeah. Do you think, and there's quite a few comments in the chat around council tax, and council tax is about 60%, or if your district about 2/3 of your spending power now. But there's a lot of the people that I speak to, they might be stranded on a really low bandee historically, and the referendum has meant they can catch up, but and find themselves every time, if there's no extra government funding, they'll fall behind necessarily because either low tax base or low bandee. Do you think there's anything the government can and possibly will do around the council tax differentials, given that council taxes tend towards 2/3 of the whole cake these days?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably what I was hinting at. If you did want to have a continuing situation that was closer to the status quo, you would ideally want to do two things. You want to do something introduce more money into the system to the extent that you could, and given all the constraints that apply. And you'd also want to think about whether there were short-term changes in resource distribution that you could make. Yeah. So whether you said, we're not in a position to do a full measure of reform, but it's some time since council tax equalisation has been updated. So maybe there's a sort of messy short-term change that we can make to do that, to move towards a likely destination for reform without going the full hog, and to be able to do that relatively quickly. Similarly, other issues on to change distribution. I know that, again, Adrian, that the most likely course may be to retain New Home's bonus, but if you did scrap it, you would free up some money to use in more creative ways to make it a more acceptable political package.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think something you could do, like some kind of nod towards equalisation that kind of sits outside SFA in the way they've done around, within social care grants.
Yes.
And I wonder whether, maybe we talked this the other day, but whether, additional bands within Band H would generate some more resource and then equalise that. I wonder whether, something like a windfall tax on business rate growth,
Yes.
so you've not fully reset the baseline, but you said anyone who's got retained growth of more than 10% of baseline, then we'll do it. Yeah, we'll do a short-term adjustment. Just things that are outside or around the periphery of the system. You're not digging the system up. You just
Exactly. That's the sort of thing I'm hinting at. Really, a little bit more creative thought that helps win support for what's fundamentally a rolling forward of the existing system to give short-term stability and buy more time for more fundamental reform. As I say again, I think that is less likely than the core package that you outlined earlier that we've been talking about for some months, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, good point. Tony.
Well, I don't want to jump in if everybody else is standing in a line because I've spoken already, but I'm just on this question of, how to squeeze a bit more money out of changing the system. One thing that if you, given that the government is absolutely totally committed to this higher growth, this magic higher growth thing, and a lot of that is to be achieved by more house building, more commercial development, more any development. It seems to me very hard to do that without actually rewarding the authorities that do it.
Yeah.
Once you start, if you were to start taxing or taking away new homes bonus, which I'm not saying you suggested, or even taxing business rate growth above a threshold, you're immediately taxing growth. And in some ways, they need to reward councils that give planning permissions in any way they can to incentivize. That's, if you were in the United States, you change the zoning system in an American town or county, the municipality keeps all the money. So I think there'll be a really powerful pressure, certainly from authorities that want to develop, to say we want to keep all the proceeds of growth. And that's what I'd say if I were them. Now that has profound implications for equalisation.
No, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And we think of it as ways you can change the system around the edges, but you're quite right. Their big objective is economic growth, and the people
the issue with
they reward us to do it. Yeah.
The issue with that, and Anna, I see you still on, so don't listen to this. The last place I worked at had an airport, had the England's biggest, or the UK's biggest cargo airport inside it. It grows irrespective of very good council, but irrespective of what the council does. If you've got a motorway, you've got an airport, you've got a transport hub, you will grow unless you're spectacularly bad at planning and don't allow it. And it's the same with housing growth. So I've worked with a number of authorities who they just won't grow. They're not, where I live is next to Dartmoor. It's never going to grow particularly, housing or business rates. So it'll find itself falling behind that, as lots of other rural, some urban authorities will, if they're not near those main links. And that's my problem with that, is what are you going to do for the authorities that, despite best efforts and despite being run well, aren't going to benefit from any significant growth just because of the demographic characteristics?
It depends where you think your key levers are and how effective they are. I mean, the homes bonus now has withered on the vine, and there's relatively little money available, and the deadweight cost for much of that is considerable. So as an incentive at the margin, it's limited, but there will always be contrary lobbying. Absolutely.
Well, and the new homes bonus anyway was an attempt to mimic what would happen in a system where councils kept council tax if they developed more housing. That's all it was. So, and I take the point entirely, but the logic of equalisation, what do you do with places that can't or won't grow, is that you effectively say to places, if you grow, you don't get any extra tax. That's how equalisation works. And it's a profoundly, the fight between the desire to grow and full equalisation it's a sort of perfect policy nightmare. Not new, but perfect.
Yeah. And I
That
guess
tends to be why the compromise is incomplete equalisation.
That's true. That's true. Do you think though that based on that we've got to change our mindset? We think in terms of fairness, equality, equalisation. Everyone has to have a level playing field, and actually, if you want to get more growth, then you have to accept there will be more inequality. Some places can just grow more, and if you allow them to keep the proceeds of that growth, they'll invest more and they'll grow even more. And actually, that will necessarily mean that some places do fall behind, even though they are well run. Could this government cope with that? I guess is the question.
I mean, that's what they've said they kind of want. I mean, they're perilously close. Once you say growth, economic growth is the thing that really matters in order to sustain this government's capacity to deliver any higher public spending on anything, which is actually true, by the way, then the Treasury will, I'm afraid, be precisely saying, let's allow the places that can grow fastest.
Yeah.
But this was the question on which much of the devolution effort in the last Labour administration faltered on, which is when they came across the question of minimum standards everywhere for public services. Devolution was only allowed to the extent that everyone was required to deliver minimum standards, and that in turn meant monitoring, publishing, and then intervening in areas where those minimum standards failed to be achieved. So the question is whether at some point someone stands up and says this isn't working. This kind of red capitalism is not providing for the areas that are falling behind. But it's absolutely right. That's the logic of what they set out for the moment.
Yeah. Can the civil servants cope with it? Can the ministers cope with it? I don't know. It's going to be fascinating, isn't it?
I've noticed in the chat, Lee's asked for the £10 rather than £5, which most districts would now agree with. And when I had a year advising DCN, we really pushed for that, and we got absolutely nothing from government there. So it'd be interesting again to see whether a change in government changes the attitude towards that, and those authorities, districts and upper tiers that are stranded on really low bandies. Because you've got Brackland in districts that's just past £100. You've got Ipswich, which is closer to £400. 3% on £400 is £12. 3% on £100 is £3. All of the things being equal, Ipswich will continue to race ahead of Brackland and others like Brackland, unless something is given to those districts stranded on low bandies. But the same, I would suggest, applies in upper tier, where there's some chronically low bandies and chronically low tax bases to equalise against.
Yeah. So, although Dan, some of those low bandies, they're very proud of their low bandies because they've
and some were very proud of the low bandies, and they're now starting to realise that perhaps 10 years on it wasn't the best thing. But politicians tend to be proud, officers tend to pull their hair out.
That's true. We've reached the end of our allotted time. It's 11:30. Thank you all very much for coming along, and thanks for staying along, and thanks for contributing as well. That was really interesting. And thanks for pulling us up short, Tony, on that, changing my thinking about how things might work. It's good stuff.
Random thoughts.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Brilliant. See you soon. Thanks, then. Bye now. Bye-bye.